Sea roads, exchange across the Indian Ocean. If the Silk Roads linked Eurasian societies by land, sea-based trade routes likewise connected distant peoples all across the Eastern Hemisphere. For example, since the days of the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans, the Mediterranean Sea had been an avenue of maritime commerce throughout the region, a pattern that continued during the Third Wave era. The Italian city of Venice emerged by 1000 CE as a major center of that commercial network, with its ships and merchants active in the Mediterranean and Black Seas as well as on the Atlantic coast. Much of its wealth derived from control of expensive and profitable imported goods from Asia, many of which came up the Red Sea through the Egyptian port of Alexandria. There, Venetian merchants picked up those goods and resold them throughout the Mediterranean basin. This type of trans-regional exchange linked the maritime commerce of the Mediterranean Sea to the much larger and more extensive network of seaborne trade in the Indian Ocean basin. Until the creation of a genuinely global oceanic system of trade after 1500, the Indian Ocean represented the world's largest sea-based system of communication and exchange, stretching from southern China to eastern Africa. Like the Silk Roads, these transoceanic trade routes, the sea roads, also grew out of the vast environmental and cultural diversities of the region. The desire for various goods not available at home, such as porcelain from China, spices from the islands of Southeast Asia, cotton goods and pepper from India, ivory and gold from the East African coast, incense from southern Arabia, provided incentives for Indian Ocean commerce. Transportation costs were lower on the sea roads than on the Silk Roads because ships could accommodate larger and heavier cargoes than camels. This meant that the sea roads could eventually carry more bulk goods and products destined for a mass market: textiles, pepper, timber, rice, sugar, wheat, whereas the Silk Roads were limited largely to luxury goods for the few. What made Indian Ocean commerce possible were the monsoons, alternating wind currents that blew predictably northeast during the summer months and southwest during the winter. An understanding of monsoons and a gradually accumulating technology of shipbuilding and oceanic navigation drew on the ingenuity of many peoples: Chinese, Malays, Indians, Arabs, Swahilis, and others. Collectively, they made an interlocked human world joined by the common highway of the Indian Ocean. But this world of Indian Ocean commerce did not occur between entire regions, and certainly not between countries, even though historians sometimes write about India, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, or East Africa as a matter of shorthand or convenience. It operated rather across an archipelago of towns, whose merchants often had more in common with one another than with the people of their own hinterlands. These urban centers, strung out around the entire Indian Ocean basin, provided the nodes of this widespread commercial network. Weaving the web of an Indian Ocean world. The world of Indian Ocean commerce was long in the making, dating back to the time of the first civilizations. Seaborne trade via the Persian Gulf between ancient Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization is reflected in archaeological finds in both places. Perhaps the still undeciphered Indian writing system was stimulated by Sumerian cuneiform. The ancient Egyptians, and later the Phoenicians, likewise traded down the Red Sea, exchanging their manufactured goods for gold, ivory, frankincense, and slaves from the coasts of Ethiopia, Somalia, and southern Arabia. These ventures mostly hugged the coast and took place over short distances. Malay sailors, however, were an exception to this rule. Speaking Austronesian languages, they jumped off from the islands of present-day Indonesia during the first millennium BCE and made their way in double outrigger canoes across thousands of miles of open ocean to the East African islands of Madagascar. There they introduced their language and their crops, bananas, coconuts, and taro, which soon spread to the mainland, where they greatly enriched the diets of African peoples. Also finding its way to the continent was a Malayo-Polynesian xylophone, which is still played in parts of Africa today. A casualty of this migration, coupled with the later arrival of Bantu-speaking Africans, was the extinction of the elephant bird, a huge flightless bird weighing up to 600 pounds and found only in Madagascar. The tempo of Indian Ocean commerce picked up in the era of second-wave civilizations during the early centuries of the Common Era, as mariners learned how to ride the monsoons. Various technological innovations also facilitated Indian Ocean trade. Improvements in sails, new kinds of ships called junks with sternpost rudders and keels for greater stability, new means of calculating latitude such as the astrolabe, and evolving versions of the magnetic needle or compass. Around the time of Christ, The Greek geographer Strabo reported that great fleets from the Roman Empire are sent as far as India, whence the most valuable cargoes are brought back to Egypt and thence exported again to other places. Merchants from the Roman world, mostly Greeks, Syrians, and Jews, established settlements in southern India and along the East African coast. The introduction of Christianity into both Aksum and Kerala in southern India testifies to the long-term cultural impact of that trade. In the Eastern Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, Chinese and Southeast Asian merchants likewise generated a growing commerce, and by 100 CE, Chinese traders had reached India. The fulcrum of this growing commercial network lay in India itself. Its ports bulged with goods from both west and east, as illustrated in the snapshot above. Its merchants were in touch with Southeast Asia by the 1st century CE, and settled communities of Indian traders appeared throughout the Indian Ocean basin and as far away as Alexandria in Egypt. Indian cultural practices such as Hinduism and Buddhism, as well as South Asian political ideas, began to take root in Southeast Asia. In the era of third wave civilizations between 500 and 1500, two major processes changed the landscape of the Afro-Eurasian world and wove the web of Indian Ocean exchange even more densely than before. One was the economic and political revival of China, some 4 centuries after the collapse of Han Dynasty. Especially during the Tang and Song dynasties, China reestablished an effective and unified state, which actively encouraged maritime trade. Furthermore, the impressive growth of the Chinese economy sent Chinese products pouring into the circuits of Indian Ocean commerce, while providing a vast and attractive market for Indian and Southeast Asian goods. Chinese technological innovations, such as larger ships and the magnetic compass, likewise added to the momentum of commercial growth. A second transformation in the world of Indian Ocean commerce involved the sudden rise of Islam in the 7th century CE, and its subsequent spread across much of the Afro-Eurasian world. Unlike Confucian culture, which was quite suspicious of merchants, Islam was friendly to commercial life. The Prophet Muhammad himself had been a trader. The creation of an Arab empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean through the Mediterranean basin and all the way to India brought together in a single political system an immense range of economic and cultural traditions, and provided a vast arena for the energies of Muslim traders. Those energies greatly intensified commercial activity in the Indian Ocean basin. Middle Eastern gold and silver flowed into southern India to purchase pepper, pearls, textiles, and gemstones. Muslim merchants and sailors, as well as Jews and Christians living within the Islamic world, established communities of traders from East Africa to the South China coast. Efforts to reclaim wasteland in Mesopotamia to produce sugar and dates for export stimulated a slave trade from East Africa, which landed thousands of Africans in southern Iraq to work on plantations and in salt mines under horrendous conditions. A massive 15-year revolt among these slaves badly disrupted the Islamic Abbasid Empire before that rebellion was brutally crushed. Beyond these specific outcomes, the expansion of Islam gave rise to an international maritime culture by 1000, shared by individuals living in the widely separated port cities around the Indian Ocean. The immense prestige, power, and prosperity of the Islamic world stimulated widespread conversion, which in turn facilitated commercial transactions. Even those who did not convert to Islam, such as Buddhist rulers in Burma, nonetheless regarded it as commercially useful to assume Muslim names. Thus was created a maritime Silk Road, a commercial and informational network of unparalleled proportions. After 1000, the culture of this network was increasingly Islamic. Sea roads as a catalyst for change. Southeast Asia. Oceanic commerce transformed all of its participants in one way or another, but nowhere more so than in Southeast Asia and East Africa, at opposite ends of the Indian Ocean network. In both regions, trade stimulated political change as ambitious or aspiring rulers used the wealth derived from commerce to construct larger and more centrally governed states or cities. Both areas likewise experienced cultural change as local people were attracted to foreign religious ideas from Confucian, Hindu, Buddhist, or Islamic sources. As on the Silk Roads, trade was conduit for culture. Located between the major civilizations of China and India, Southeast Asia was situated by geography to play an important role in the evolving world of Indian Ocean commerce. During the Third Wave era, a series of cities and states or kingdoms emerged on both the islands and mainland of Southeast Asia, representing new civilizations in this vast region. That process paralleled a similar development of new civilizations in East and West Africa, Japan, Russia, and Western Europe, in what was an Afro-Eurasian phenomenon. In Southeast Asia, many of those new societies were stimulated and decisively shaped by their interaction with the sea-based trade of the Indian Ocean. The case of Srivijaya illustrates the connection between commerce and state buildings. When Malay sailors, long active in the waters around Southeast Asia, opened an all-sea route between India and China through the Straits of Malacca around 350 CE, the many small ports along the Malay Peninsula and the coast of Sumatra began to compete intensely to attract the growing number of traders and travelers making their way through the straits. From this competition emerged the Malay kingdom of Srivijaya, which dominated this critical choke point of Indian Ocean trade from 670 to 1025. A number of factors, Srivijaya's plentiful supply of gold, its access to the source of highly sought-after spices such as cloves, nutmeg, and mace, and the taxes levied on passing ships provided resources to attract supporters, to fund an embryonic bureaucracy, and to create the military and naval forces that brought some security to the area. The inland states on the mainland of Southeast Asia, whose economies were based more on domestically produced rice than on international trade, nonetheless participated in the commerce of the region. The state of Funan, which flourished during the 6 centuries of the Common Era in what is now southern Vietnam and eastern Cambodia, hosted merchants from both India and China. Archaeologists have found Roman coins as well as trade goods from Persia, Central Asia, and Arabia in the ruins of its ancient cities. The Mer Kingdom of Angkor exported exotic forest products, receiving in return Chinese and Indian handicrafts, while welcoming a considerable community of Chinese merchants. Traders from Champa in what is now central and southern Vietnam operated in China, Java, and elsewhere, practicing piracy when trade dried up. Champa's efforts to control the trade between China and Southeast Asia provoked warfare with its commercial rivals. Beyond the exchange of goods, commercial connections served to spread elements of Indian culture across much of Southeast Asia, even as Vietnam was incorporated into the Chinese sphere of influence. Indian alphabets such as Sanskrit and Pallava were used to write a number of Southeast Asian languages. Indian artistic forms provided models from Southeast Asian sculpture and architecture, while the Indian epic Ramayana became widely popular across the region. Politically, Southeast Asian rulers and elites found attractive the Indian belief that leaders were god-kings, perhaps reincarnations of a Buddha or the Hindu deity Shiva, while the idea of karma conveyed legitimacy to the rich and powerful based on their moral behavior in early lives. Srivijayan monarchs, for example, employed Indians as advisors, clerks, or officials, and assigned Sanskrit titles to their subordinates. The capital city of Palembang was a cosmopolitan place where even the parrots were said to speak 4 languages. While these rulers drew on indigenous beliefs that chiefs possessed magical powers and were responsible for the prosperity of their people, they also made use of imported Indian political ideas and Buddhist religious concepts, which provided a higher level of magic for rulers as well as the prestige of association with Indian civilization. They also sponsored the creation of images of the Buddha and various bodhisattvas, whose faces resembled those of deceased kings and were inscribed with traditional curses against anyone who would destroy them. Srivijaya grew into a major center of Buddhist observance and teaching, attracting thousands of monks and students from throughout the Buddhist world. The 7th century Chinese monk Yi Jing was so impressed that he advised Buddhist monks headed for India to study first in Srivijaya for several years. Elsewhere as well, elements of Indian culture took hold in Southeast Asia. The Sailendra kingdom in southern Java, an agriculturally rich region closely allied with Srivijaya, mounted a massive building program between the 8th and 10th centuries featuring Hindu temples and Buddhist monuments. The most famous, known as Borobudur, is an enormous mountain-shaped structure of 10 levels with a 3-mile walkway and elaborate carvings illustrating the spiritual journey from ignorance and delusion to full enlightenment. The largest Buddhist monument anywhere in the world, it is nonetheless a distinctly Javanese creation, whose carved figures have Javanese features and whose scenes are clearly set in Java, not India. Its shape resonated with an ancient Southeast veneration of mountains as sacred places and the abode of ancestral spirits. Borobudur represents the process of Buddhism becoming culturally grounded in a new place. Hinduism too, though not an explicitly missionary religion, found a place in Southeast Asia. It was well rooted in the Champa kingdom, for example, where Shiva was worshipped, cows were honored, and phallic imagery was prominent. But it was in the prosperous and powerful Angkor kingdom of the 12th century CE that Hinduism found its most stunning architectural expression in the temple complex known as Angkor Wat, the largest religious structure in the pre-modern world. It sought to express a Hindu understanding of the cosmos, centered on a mythical Mount Meru, the home of the gods in Hindu tradition. Later, it was used by Buddhists as well, with little sense of contradiction. To the west of Angkor, the state of Pagan likewise devoted enormous resources to shrines, temples, and libraries, inspired by both Hindu and Buddhist faiths. The extensive Indian influence in Southeast Asia has led some scholars to speak of the Indianization of the region, similar perhaps to the earlier spread of Greek culture within the empires of Alexander the Great and Rome. In the case of Southeast Asia, however, no imperial control accompanied Indian cultural influence. It was a matter of voluntary borrowing from independent societies that found Indian traditions and practices useful and were free to adapt these ideas to their own needs and cultures. Traditional religious practices mixed with the imported faiths or existed alongside them with little conflict, and much that was distinctively Southeast Asian persisted, despite influences from afar. In family life, for example, most Southeast Asian societies traced an individual's ancestry from both the mother's and father's line, in contrast to India and China, where patrilineal descent was practiced. Furthermore, women had fewer restrictions and a greater role in public life than in the more patriarchal civilizations of both East and South Asia. They were generally able to own property together with their husbands and to initiate divorce. A Chinese visitor to Angkor observed, "It is the women who are concerned with commerce." Women in Angkor also served as gladiators, warriors, and members of the palace staff, and as poets, artists, and religious teachers. Almost 1,800 realistically carved images of women decorate the temple complex of Angkor Wat. In neighboring Pagan, a 13th century queen, Pwa exercised extensive political and religious influence for some 40 years amid internal intrigue and external threats, while donating some of her lands and property to a Buddhist temple. Somewhat later, but also via Indian Ocean commerce, Islam too began to penetrate Southeast Asia as the world of seaborne trade brought yet another cultural tradition to the region. Sea roads as a catalyst for change, East Africa. On the other side of the Indian Ocean, the transformative process of long-distance trade were likewise at work, giving rise to an East African civilization known as Swahili. Emerging in the 8th century CE, this civilization took shape as a set of commercial city-states stretching all along the East African coast from present-day Somalia to Mozambique. The earlier ancestors of the Swahili lived in small farming and fishing communities, spoke Bantu languages, and traded with the Arabian, Greek, and Roman merchants who occasionally visited the coast during the Second Wave era. But what stimulated the growth of Swahili cities was the far more extensive commercial life of the Western Indian Ocean following the rise of Islam. And in Southeast Asia, local people and aspiring rulers found opportunity for wealth and power in the growing demand for East African products associated with an expanding Indian Ocean commerce. Gold, ivory, quartz, leopard skins, and sometimes slaves acquired from interior societies, as well as iron and processed timber manufactured along the coast, found a ready market in Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. At least one East African giraffe found its way to Bengal, in northeastern India, and from there was sent on to China. In response to such commercial opportunities, an African merchant class developed. Villages turned into sizable towns, and clan chiefs became kings. A new civilization was in the making. Between 1000 and 1500, that civilization flourished along the coast, and it was a very different kind of society from the farming and pastoral cultures of the East African interior. It was thoroughly urban, centered in cities of 15,000 to 18,000 people, such as Lamu, Mombasa, Kilwa, Sofala, and many others. Like the city-states of ancient Greece, each Swahili city was politically independent, was generally governed by its own king, and was in sharp competition with the other cities. No imperial system or larger territorial states unified the world of Swahili civilization, nor did any of these city-states control a critical choke point of trade, as Srivijaya did for the Straits of Malacca. Swahili cities were commercial centers that accumulated goods from the interior and exchanged them for the products of distant civilizations, such as Chinese porcelain and silk, Persian rugs, and Indian cottons. While the transoceanic journeys occurred largely in Arab vessels, Swahili craft navigated the coastal waterways, concentrating goods for shipment abroad. This long-distance trade generated class-stratified urban societies with sharp distinctions between a mercantile elite and commoners. Culturally as well as economically, Swahili civilization participated in the larger Indian Ocean world. Arab, Indian, and Persian merchants were welcome visitors and some settled permanently. Many ruling families of Swahili cities claimed Arab or Persian origin as a way of bolstering their prestige, even while they dined from Chinese porcelain and dressed in Indian cottons. The Swahili language, widely spoken in East Africa today, was grammatically an African tongue within the larger Bantu family of languages, but it was written in Arabic script and contained a number of Arabic loanwords. A small bronze lion found in the Swahili city of Shanga and dating to about 1100 illustrates the distinctly cosmopolitan character of Swahili culture. It depicted a clearly African lion, but it was created in a distinctly Indian artistic style and was made from melted down Chinese copper coins. Furthermore, Swahili civilization rapidly became Islamic. Introduced by Arab traders, Islam was voluntarily and widely adopted within the Swahili world. Like Buddhism in Southeast Asia, Islam linked Swahili cities to the larger Indian Ocean world, and these East Indian cities were soon dotted with substantial mosques. When Ibn Battuta, a widely traveled Arab scholar, merchant, and public official, visited the Swahili coast in the early 14th centuries, he found altogether Muslim societies in which religious leaders often spoke Arabic and were eager to welcome a learned Islamic visitor. But these were African Muslims, not colonies of transplanted Arabs. A prominent historian of Ibn Battuta's travels commented on Swahili society. The rulers, scholars, officials, and big merchants, as well as the port workers, farmers, craftsmen, and slaves, were dark-skinned people speaking African tongues in everyday life. Islam sharply divided the Swahili cities from their African neighbors to the west, for neither the new religion nor Swahili culture penetrated much beyond the coast until the 19th century. Economically, however, the coastal cities acted as intermediaries between the interior producers of valued goods and the Arab merchants who carried them to distant markets. Particularly in the southern reaches of the Swahili world, this relationship extended the impact of Indian Ocean trade well into the African interior. Hundreds of miles inland between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers lay rich sources of gold, much in demand on the Swahili coast. The emergence of a powerful state, known as Great Zimbabwe, seems clearly connected to the growing trade in gold to the coast, as well as to the wealth embodied in its large herds of cattle. At its peak between 1250 and 1350, Great Zimbabwe had the resources and the labor to construct huge stone enclosures entirely without mortar, with walls 16 feet thick and 32 feet tall. It must have been an astonishing sight, writes a recent historian, for the subordinate chiefs and kings who would have come there to seek favors at court. Here in the interior of southeastern Africa lay yet another example of the reach and transforming power of Indian Ocean commerce.